So this session is something dear to my heart, looking at how decisions have been made during the COVID pandemic. I have to say it hasn't been easy for me to prepare this talk. It's quite difficult at this point in a pandemic when our case rates are starting to go up again. However, I have many examples to share with you around the decision making, and it's focused in the UK, this session. So, so an ideology is a set of opinions or beliefs of a group or an individual, and it often refers to political beliefs or culture. And it's a system of ideas and ideals, and especially one which forms the basis of economic or political theory and policy, which is particularly relevant because political decision making in a pandemic is what makes the difference in terms of the outcomes for the population. There's quite a lot written around science and policy making and trying to work between the two cultures. It's really hard, and those of you who've been involved in it will know that. Those of you who haven't, I wouldn't rush and be in a huge rush to do it. It can be very challenging, both locally and nationally and internationally, because this is two different cultures. Science tends to put what we know on the table, and acknowledge that that can lead to a variety of different options. And then government will consider public opinion, electoral outcomes or anticipated electoral outcomes, economic priorities and so forth, but all through the lens of ideology. So ideological differences between politics and science. In politics, is it the case that the facts alone cannot tell us what to do, which is what's been written about quite extensively in the academic literature? Or is it the case that politicians will make a conclusion or make a decision and then look at what facts they can find to underpin it? In science, we do, or the idea is that we do allow the facts to tell us what to do. We look at the facts and we say, what conclusion can we draw from those facts? When we start to do a research study, the very first part of that is to find out what's been done before in the relevant disciplines, what's been published and what's been reported on, and allow that to inform our research and a discovery as we go. So we build things, we build the knowledge in an area, and that's what guides us. Very, very different, two very, very different cultures. So I hope you can all see me changing slides. Can you just say whether you can or not? I've just thought I'm ploughing on. Can. Okay, great, thanks. So one of the founders of epidemiology, John Snow, the other major one was Florence Nightingale. He said in 1853, during the cholera epidemics in England, so the question of contagion in various diseases has often been discussed with a degree of acrimony that is unusual in medical or other scientific inquiry. The cause of the warmth of feeling that has been displayed has in most cases probably been unknown to the major disputants. It's the great pecuniary interests involved in the question on account of its connection with quarantine. So the connection between quarantine, or as we call it, lockdown, and economics is a very old one and very well established. In 2020, last year, and this year, there were many interests. There was business that was shut down, the government, which was focused on maintaining an economy of the type they favour, which we'll talk about a bit more as we go on, and the personal interests of many individuals who've really suffered very badly financially during the pandemic. Now, this plane looks weird, doesn't it? I haven't been on one of those for a very long time. But one thing I won't be talking about is air travel and travel in and out of the UK. This is allowing this to continue in the way that it has through a pandemic, with only really having limitations placed on it in the last few months. was an ideologically driven decision around seeing the UK as a travel hub, as a means of economic advantage for us and our overall economy. And as such, we allowed it to continue unchecked. And it has undoubtedly been a major influence on the number of cases and the spread of COVID and the outcomes that we've had in our population, without any doubt. It's not going to be the focus of today, but it will come up, I'm sure, as we go through the presentation. So the main things that I've been thinking about in preparing this talk is around where the tension has been over the last year and a bit. And my feeling is, within the context of the already different cultures of science and politics, we then have political ideology in the picture too. And without it, we can't really explain why the outcomes are what they are for the UK. My feelings are that when the scientific evidence or the expert opinion fits with the political ideology of the moment, then we have harmony and we have what appears to be evidence-based policy. It feels comfortable to the politicians at that moment. It fits with what they feel is an appropriate type of decision making. And there are many examples that we're going to consider in the presentation of how that's worked with COVID. But when the science or expert opinion doesn't fit the prevailing political ideology, then we have had chaos, divergence of opinion, and delay. And as we all know, one of the major causes of our high death rate and the many people who suffered with COVID and now long COVID in the UK has been as a result of that political decision-making delay. So this was my attempt at a diagram. Apologies if it doesn't make sense to you, but I do feel that it's so important that when politics and science come together, or scientific expert opinion, that without ideology we cannot really understand it. So this is where I'm going to start to introduce some of the more complicated areas within our response in the UK. So last year, the mortality rates from COVID in the most deprived areas were more than double the least deprived areas for both males and females. And this is greater than the ratio for all-cause mortality in the previous 4 years, indicating greater inequality in death rates from COVID-19 than any other causes. So COVID-19 is intimately connected with deprivation, with poor areas and people living on a low income. Now, I've put the word disparities in red because it's unusual language. We talk about health inequalities, which are measurable differences in health outcomes for different income groups. They apply all across the world. Every country has them. Every human being is part of this. And it's a continuum from very low income up to very high income. And health outcomes change as you progress through that. If you're in Bournemouth, if you travel from Bournemouth Square to Boscombe High Street, which is little more than a mile, maybe a mile and a half, you probably will gain 8 or 9 years of extra life, depending on where you live. They're real health inequalities, are real measurable differences in health outcomes. Disparities is a word that I haven't seen on a government report since Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. We weren't allowed to talk about health inequalities then. It wasn't accepted that that was a real thing. However, now the evidence base is substantially more, although it was quite clear at that time as well. And yet here this word is again. So it's interesting because disparities, what does disparities mean? It means differences, I guess. Okay, but it's not so clear and it doesn't show that it's unequal. And then there's another word, which is inequities, which is also used commonly. And inequities in health outcomes are ones which are preventable. So differences in health outcome for different income groups, which are preventable and therefore unjust. So again, language is really important, particularly in politics, and it may be that that focus on health inequalities for the public health community, right through from Public Health England right down to the local directors of public health in every county, has been something that the political ideology for our government has not wanted to engage with in this during this period, which, as I'm going to show you, has had some substantial costs. So a study of adults, 2,500 adults, found that both race and poverty were associated with higher risks of hospitalization. Only poverty and financial hardship were associated with higher risks of escalation to intensive care units. This suggests that environmental factors associated with poorer socioeconomic circumstances tend to have more adverse outcomes with COVID compared to biological factors. Reasons may be continued active employment where working from home is not feasible, using public transport despite lockdowns, and the combination of these may increase exposure to viral load and worsen overall prognosis. Good study, published last year, however, not really showing all the complexities around inequalities in health and disease that are particularly relevant for COVID. So this year, the newly revealed analysis by the Joint Biosecurity Centre, a government agency set up in May 2020, in addition to Public Health England, concluded that interconnected factors such as deprivation, poor housing and work conditions and delays in the test and trace system were all likely to be significant contributors to the high coronavirus rates in some areas. And in February 2021, deprivation and ethnicity were for the first time recognised as risk factors for severe COVID in new modelling, which led to 1.7 million more people being advised to shield and 800,000 being fast-tracked. So it took us a long time, and I think the first time that ethnicity was recognised in scientific studies in relation to COVID was around May 2020. So what are the social determinants of health? What are we alluding to when we're talking about them? So global research shows us that they are more important than healthcare or lifestyle choices in influencing health. And in our neoliberal societies, we tend to feel that everything is our own personal responsibility. And I know that I withdrew from Facebook because I couldn't stand the continuous, well, if people would only pull themselves together and, you know, everyone has an equal level playing field, why can't people just, you know, pull themselves together and get on with things? But life isn't like that, and the evidence very, very much overwhelmingly tells us internationally that the context in which we live, these social determinants that I'm going to go through, are more important, or at least as important as our own lifestyle choices and healthcare. And the contribution of sectors outside the healthcare sector to population health outcomes exceeds the contribution from the health sector. In fact, in public health, my own speciality, it's accepted that clean water, so civil engineering, and then vaccinations are the two most important factors around increasing life expectancy. So what are these social determinants? Let's have a look at them in a bit more detail. So there's income and social protection, education, unemployment and job insecurity, working life conditions, food insecurity, housing, early childhood development, social inclusion and non-discrimination, structural conflict, and access to affordable, good quality healthcare. So you can see clearly how all of these are vitally relevant to COVID and a political response to COVID. And all of these negatively impact on health outcomes for those people, families and communities who experience them globally. We're all in it together. So what could have been done differently or better, arguably, using a more social determinants informed approach in relation to COVID? We had some income protection, so people could be furloughed and claim financial help. However, there is millions of people who've been excluded from that, and the government have been lobbied extensively to try and change that. But at the moment, millions of UK taxpayers are excluded from that support, and for technical reasons, essentially. One group is those who make less than half their income from being self-employed, moving between jobs, such as in the creative industries, can also exclude you from financial support. Short-term contracts, no contracts, insecure employment, the gig economy, all those things, which were so common in our economy prior to COVID. Oddly, company directors sometimes fall foul of the system because you can't, if your income was more than 50,000 a year in 2018-19, you can't claim support. And all those who've been made redundant during the pandemic, of which there has been many. So again, and what would really have helped in terms of the social determinants of health is targeted financial help for key workers to shield at home when they are symptomatic, encouraged to take COVID testing regularly, and being able to not go to work if they test positive without it impacting on their income, because this has obviously been a big factor in influencing the spread of the disease. So education, targeted help with IT resources who need them for study or work. Obviously, we've relied entirely on IT resources. At the university, we've had a lot of IT help, although a lot of frustrations as well still, I have to say. But again, particularly families on a low income, it took quite a long time for any support for those. And then it was around through schools, so it wasn't very responsive or quick, and they often run out of resources. Unemployment, well, benefit support, redeployment for those who lose their jobs due to the pandemic. Very hard to get another job in the pandemic, but could have been made easier by redeployment or retraining opportunities. A big one in terms of healthcare workers, for instance, and social care workers, and all those serving the public during the pandemic, is adequate protection. Adequate personal protective equipment, PPE, for people. And at the moment, COVID is being considered as to whether it is in fact an occupational disease in the UK. It's passed the first test, which is whether it's more than twice as likely you'll get that disease at work. For those who work in sectors where they're public facing, particularly health and social care, then it is much more than twice as likely that you'll get it. But there's more hoops for the process to go through. And again, one suspects that that process might be politically influenced because of the cost of claims for those many people who've died, thousands of people who've died through catching it at work. And also there's an ongoing discussion, should I say discussion, or I don't want to say the word denial, but it kind of slipped out, around COVID being transmitted via aerosol infection, because that means that another standard of masks, etc., is required for workers who are exposed directly in their work to those who they know are infected. And that we've suspected, and there's been studies showing that COVID was aerosol spread rather than just droplet spread like flu since the middle of last year. But it has been recognised by Public Health England in the last couple of months that that is the case. But again, one wonders whether there's been any obfuscation around that science or blocking of those findings, in the same way as we're having trouble getting access to how COVID is spreading in schools at the moment. So 5, food poverty, and 6, I've put a bracket around both of these because our rent levels are so high in the UK that I suspect that food poverty is being caused by having a very high rents to pay. So people are forced to choose between having a home and eating. And there's also been extensive food poverty through the pandemic, as I'm sure you're aware from the news, etc., with many food banks working and many families, over 4 million families and children living in poverty now. We have no rent control. Again, this is a political decision. This is something that would be a national policy, which many other countries have, which means that everyone is exposed, no matter what their income, is exposed to the housing market, the housing rental market. Again, political decision. Early childhood development, health visitors and general practitioners and midwives, as I've listed there. Health visitors were redeployed away from their work often in the early part of the pandemic, so not being available so much to support families, particularly those in difficult, chaotic circumstances, which would have had an impact on early childhood development, and also around the increases in domestic violence, which have been substantial during the pandemic. And the reason for that is that our health services were effectively overwhelmed. And the reason they were overwhelmed is because we didn't have an effective test, track, trace and isolate system. The decision was made by the government to privately pay for that system, with companies who had no experience of providing it, despite, as we're going to find out in a minute, that we have a public health infrastructure in the UK provided by public health specialists who are specifically tasked with doing that work and do it all the time normally, have a lot of experience, a lot of community contacts, etc., already set up. They're already being paid by the local authorities everywhere, but for some reason our government went to a private provision to do that, and there's also been questions around the commissioning of that work and the setting up of contracts, etc., and whether that complied with the law. So if we'd have had that system, we could have isolated and managed outbreaks rather than having national lockdowns in the way that we did. When that system was set up, there was a less than 50% success rate in terms of tracking, tracing and encouraging people to isolate. Since public health teams have been able to undertake some of that work, which wasn't permitted, they weren't given data, etc., or access until early 2021. Again, politically, ideologically driven decision making, which meant that they couldn't take that work on. But since they have done, their success rates are regularly 96 to 100% in terms of that test, track, trace and isolate system. Social inclusion, discrimination, ensuring equal access to services and support. Now, this means if you're going to have equal access, you need to target positively deprived communities with extra resources to make a level playing field, because normally in the UK, those communities have less access to healthcare, less access to support, often less access to food provision, less access to healthcare, less access to childcare, all the things that are needed in life, and social care. And so in order to make it equal, one needs to actively acknowledge that it's not on a level playing field normally and target extra resources. Now, conflict number 9 is a really fascinating one. In the midst of Brexit. This is my opinion, that we should be prioritising international trade, aid, which we've also cut the aid budget, remember, and cooperation to maintain and build on relationships in times of crisis, such as a pandemic. And this is not the time to be undertaking divisive foreign policy. There's also something around new trade deals with countries which are thousands of miles away too, and how good that is for the environment. And then number 10, access to health services, and again, and those not becoming overwhelmed. And the way to prevent them becoming overwhelmed is to manage the outbreak. As we said, manage the outbreak, use the resources you already have, and manage outbreaks effectively. So I just wanted to show you the current areas with high numbers of the Delta variant from this week. So the government has given extra guidance for people in the following areas of England, which means effectively a tighter lockdown. So I've listed them there: Manchester, Blackburn with Darwin, Lancashire, Kirklees, Bedford, Leicester, Hounslow, North Tyneside, Birmingham, Blackpool, Cheshire East, Cheshire West, Chester, Liverpool and Warrington. And in these places, wherever possible, people should meet friends and family outside, keep 6 feet apart, and minimise travel in and out of affected areas. And this is the top 20 areas with the most deprived neighbourhoods in England from 2019. And you'll see all the ones in white are the ones that are falling within that extra tighter lockdown currently. Although I have to say, I did go through last year's as well. And since the beginning of COVID, I think 18 out of those 20 areas have been an extra lockdown at some point because of higher rates of infection. So infectious disease and deprivation, areas of low income, go hand in hand, always have done. Any public health practitioner, any public health specialist will tell you that's what we learn in our training, and it occurs everywhere in the world. So there's still areas in the world that are suffering with malaria very much. We don't have that. We got rid of our malaria. And Ebola every year, and measles and polio. So these things we know, and these things we're experts in. It's interesting, and I should mention that there was no on SAGE group initially when all this started. That's the scientific advisory group for England to the government and for emergencies. That there was no public health specialist on that group, which is why there's been an alternative SAGE set up, which is dominated by public health specialists to offer alternative advice. Again, was it the fact that public health focuses very much on reducing the inequalities in health and sustainability as the two key pillars of practice? And does that disagree with current political ideology? Maybe we'll answer it in the questions at the end of the presentation. I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea about who's bearing the brunt of the financial decision making and financial policies, again, ideologically driven. Make the assumption that it's a level playing field for people and for families. So 4 million children are living in a family who've lost income. 27% of UK families are living on a reduced income in comparison with 17% of those without children. 3 million children live in families who are struggling with finding food and other necessities, and using twice as many families with children are using credit. 13% of families are behind with their rent or mortgage. 5% of households without children are behind. And 16% of families with children are behind with household bills, compared with 7% of those without children. And 4.9 million are living without any savings currently. And the this financial impact tracker, you can find various publications on the internet, and I would recommend it if you're interested in this area around fiscal management during the pandemic, and who is benefiting and who isn't benefiting. So I hope this isn't going to confuse everyone, but there's a saying in public health which is or a theory around something called a syndemic, and this is used to describe infectious or diseases which have biological and social interactions that are important for prognosis, treatment, and health policy. And I've mentioned NCDs here. Now, NCDs at the top, I've included a hypertension, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular, and chronic respiratory diseases and cancer. And you will remember that COVID, the outcomes are much worse for individuals with COVID who suffer with any of those diseases, but particularly hypertension, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular, and chronic respiratory diseases. And these NCDs are much more common in people living on a low income, and also in Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. Again, that's a global issue. We study it a lot in public health, and it's very well established in the evidence. So, writing in The Lancet in 2017, Singer argued that a syndemic approach reveals biological and social interactions that are important for prognosis, treatment, and health policy. And limiting the harm caused by COVID will demand far greater attention to non-communicable diseases and socioeconomic inequality than has hitherto been admitted. And bearing in mind, this is 2017, and we have the same political ideology now, and things are worse. And the most important consequence of seeing COVID-19 as a syndemic is to underline its social origins and the vulnerability of older citizens, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities, and key workers who are often poorly paid, with fewer welfare protections. This all points to something that's so far barely acknowledged, namely that no matter how effective a treatment or protective a vaccine, the pursuit of a purely biomedical solution to COVID-19 will fail. We need desperately to consider the underlying issues which make responses and outcomes to COVID much worse, and also where the disease never quite goes away, and that has been happening consistently during all the waves of COVID that we've had so far. So this was a depressing slide. In 2020, there were over 695,000 deaths in the United Kingdom, making that year the deadliest since 1918, the height of the Spanish influenza pandemic. As of May 30th, 2021, there have been 1,134,485 deaths across the whole of Europe due to COVID, since the first in France last February. And the United Kingdom still has the highest number of deaths in Europe, at 127,781 as of the end of May. And it's important, again, we get a lot of figures bandied around deaths and COVID, and who's got the biggest deaths and who's got the smallest number of deaths. But really the most important thing to do is look at the comparisons between the number of deaths and the size of the population always. And again, we come off very badly. We're in the top, always in the top 2 or 3 globally, which with our public health structures has been a great shock and nasty surprise for everyone working in public health. This was an interesting piece of graffiti, if you will. I think it's art, actually, probably, in Portugal. And it's got COVID, which I think is a green man at the back, and the politicians on the same side as pulling against the healthcare services. And it says, whose side are you on in English, but literally, which side of the rope are you on in Portuguese? So again, I don't think it's just purely a UK problem. This public versus private assumption that we're working with is that there, to me, underpins our current fiscal policies and political decision making during the pandemic, has been that private companies are more responsive, they have better outcomes, and they create jobs and leave a better legacy. I think COVID has shown us that is a faulty assumption. The NHS test, track, trace and isolate is actually not the NHS test, track, trace and isolate system. It's run by a private company, but NHS has been put onto that to kind of try and produce some kind of a illusion or balm for everyone. And it has failed spectacularly. There is a tracking system online. You can see a comparison week by week, I think now. Quite reliable data, which shows that, as I mentioned previously, public health teams are getting late 90s, 100% effectiveness, test, track, trace and isolate, and a private company is getting, at the moment, in the 80%, I think, but has, as you know, come up from 50 odd, 60, 70, and has taken all that time, not responsively, to get to the point where it's around 80%. Now. So the outcomes have not been good, and the legacy I'm going to talk about a bit more in a moment. The vaccination rollout, however, provided by the National Health Service, is a massive triumph, and many volunteers, I hasten to add, has been a massive triumph. So again, those kind of assumptions based on political ideology need to be considered. We've had a very unpleasant, massive natural experiment, essentially, which has shown us that we can't make those assumptions anymore. And do we have to deal with truth? I mean, the basis is in science that we're trying to create truth or try to understand through more qualitative work exactly what people's lived experiences are of different things. But it seems at the moment that if one fudges, like with naming the test, track, trace and isolate system, which doesn't work, putting NHS at the beginning of it, people don't really care. Do they care? I don't know. But it feels like people can just go ahead as the politicians, and they're not really challenged very effectively at the moment by the media or by other sections of society in any way around what is truth, what isn't truth, and how they're working with the scientific evidence. There was some talk of releasing the notes from the SAGE group to maintain transparency, and that hasn't happened. That's the advisory group for the scientific advisory group for the government. So scientists, what does that mean for us? Well, we're all outside our comfort zone, right? Because normally we wait around, we have evidence-based change, we do peer review, and all of that has changed due to COVID. We now have preprints and sharing of data, and then in many ways around the vaccine, around the DNA of the virus, etc., the structure of the virus, sharing peculiar outcomes or case studies around what happens with treatments of the virus. All that has accelerated. And people are sharing more, much more than they were, and also pushing for sharing the licensing for the vaccines so other people can produce them. Again, politics is stopping that, is putting the brakes on with some of that work. Again, political ideology around economics, for instance. So legacy investment, my elephant's there for this one. So this is an elephant in the room. Think of the potential legacy investment in services if the money spent on private company provision of test, track, trace and isolate, for instance, had been invested in existing public services. So I've just got here what the local health protection team job already was before the pandemic. So their job already was to give specialist support to prevent and reduce the effect of infectious diseases. They are already being paid to do local disease surveillance, investigating and managing health protection incidents and outbreaks, planning for infectious diseases at a local level, and delivering and monitoring national action. So again, all set up, trained. It maybe would have been a massive increase in capacity that was needed, but arguably the investment that would have gone into that would have been there available for us in the public sector in the future, in our local authorities, and also the increase in partnership working, undoubtedly, to provide that increase in capacity with private local authorities working with private business and universities, labs, etc. And we won't feel those benefits now. Those billions of pounds won't be spent on legacy benefits for future infectious diseases or just to manage COVID going into the future. One nice thing, good thing that's happened is in Bolton, the public health team were given the capacity, extra capacity to deal with their recent outbreak of the Delta variant. And they did, through their work, through their excellent test, track, trace and isolate efforts, their excellent partnerships with local community leaders, with local business, with local opinion leaders, they were able to get more people vaccinated, help people to stay at home if they were infected, and help people to abide with the required lockdown. And it did bring their cases down. So it shows you it can be done, but it's much more effective at a local level in considering particularly those social determinants of health. And the local public health expert's job normally, again, pre-COVID, is to support local action to promote and protect health and well-being, create a healthcare system which improves health and reduces inequalities in health outcomes. And again, this is all pre-COVID. So again, we would have had a legacy if we'd have been doing this, focusing in this way, putting that investment money into our teams that already existed. We would have had a massive legacy in terms of increased skills, capacity, partnership working, etc. And there is that infographics test and trace performance tracker. I won't show it to you now, so we're running out of time. So, but do have a look. Just had to say, there's also been an awful lot of this. Whose opinion matters anyway? I'm sorry, Gina, your answer was correct, but Kevin shouted his incorrect answer over yours, so he gets the points. I think the fact that the nurses, I'm a registered nurse, and that nurses have been excluded from any policy discussions over COVID is tragic and has greatly reduced the effectiveness of our response, as we are the ones who deliver the majority of healthcare and the majority of the vaccine, for instance, and also the ones who've helped nurses and healthcare and social care workers are the ones who died the most during the COVID epidemic, both nationally and internationally, most tragically. And not to have a policy voice is a gender-related issue and a historically related issue, and needs to be challenged. So on my last slide, our lovely vaccines, which are helping us, and but I think we still need to consider the political ideology which has led us not to think about inequalities in health, and has led us to have many more deaths as a result, in my opinion. And I think that historical analysis will support that. I think we need to think about infectious diseases as we always think about infectious diseases, and recognise the link, the crucial link between inequalities in health and deprivation and infectious disease. And the only thing I really left out, as I warned you I would, was the plane and international travel, as I haven't really had time to fit that in this session. But it obviously has been a massive influence on the spread of COVID, and particularly variants, and other countries who've been much more responsive and not so concerned about economics in the first iteration of their response have done much better, and they're economically they've done much better too. So our dithering and not listening to science and not listening to practical advice and not learning from what other countries have done have led to us finishing up where we are now. Thank you very much for your attention.